Let me tell you a secret. The most dangerous thing you can know in any mythology isn't the name of a monster. It's the name of the architect. Because once you know who built the prison, you realize you are living inside it. Lovecraft gave us Cthulhu, an icon of dread. But buried deeper in his texts, wrapped in layers of warning and coded madness, is something infinitely worse. Something so foundational to the horror of his universe that to speak of it is to risk a kind of existential vertigo. It is the secret behind the secret. The engine of the nightmare. Welcome back to our channel. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. What we are discussing today isn't just another monster. It is the reason monsters exist at all. This is about Azathoth, the blind idiot god, the nuclear chaos at the center of all things. And this knowledge isn't just frightening. It is, by the genre's own definition, forbidden, because understanding Azathoth isn't learning about a bigger, badder creature. It is learning that you, me, this reality, everything we consider real, is a side effect, a temporary noise in the mindless dream of an entity that cannot even comprehend our existence. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some thoughts, once thought, cannot be unthought. And the cosmos is older, stranger, and more terrifying than your mind can withstand. And the door to Azathoth's court is the one marked "Do Not Enter." Because on the other side, you don't find a villain. You don't find a plan. You find the screaming, chaotic foundation of a universe that has no meaning, no creator, and no guarantee it will still be here if the dreamer shifts in its sleep. Let's open that door. You asked about the origin of Azathoth. That implies a beginning, a story, a birth. That is the first and most comforting lie. Azathoth has no origin. Azathoth is the origin. But Howard Phillips Lovecraft did have an origin. And understanding the man who channeled this concept into fiction requires us to examine a very specific period of crisis, the years between 1919 and 1922, when everything Lovecraft thought he understood about himself, about family, about sanity, came apart. March 1921. Lovecraft's mother, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, dies in Butler Hospital, the same psychiatric institution where his father had died 26 years earlier. She had been institutionalized for 2 years. The diagnosis was melancholia. The reality was considerably darker. In her final months, she had experienced what the records delicately termed nervous exhaustion, and what we might now recognize as complete psychological dissolution. She told the staff her son was hideous, deformed, that she could barely stand to look at him. Lovecraft was 30 years old. He had never lived independently. He had no career, no prospects, no romantic relationships. His mother had been his constant companion, his financial support, his primary human connection. And in her final years, she had looked at him with revulsion. This is not biographical gossip. This is essential context. Because within a year of her death, Lovecraft began writing differently. The Gothic haunted houses and terrestrial ghouls that had populated his earlier work started giving way to something else entirely. Something cosmic. Something that didn't just threaten the body or even the mind, but the very possibility of meaning itself. The fragment titled simply Azathoth appeared in 1922. It's unfinished, barely 3 pages. But those pages establish a tone that Lovecraft would spend the rest of his life elaborating. The protagonist describes being drawn by a vague, insistent impulse toward cosmic knowledge. He hears flute music, wild and liquid, and follows it through dimensions of geometry that shouldn't exist. The fragment ends mid-sentence, as if Lovecraft himself couldn't continue, as if the act of writing it had become too destabilizing. Consider what had just happened in Lovecraft's world beyond personal tragedy. World War I had recently concluded, demonstrating that human civilization could mechanize slaughter on an industrial scale. Einstein's theory of relativity was becoming widely known, revealing that space and time were relative, that the universe operated according to principles that defied common sense. Astronomy was revealing the true scale of the cosmos. Billions of light years, countless galaxies, distances that made Earth less than a speck of dust in a cathedral. Lovecraft read voraciously, science, philosophy, astronomy, and he reached a conclusion that terrified him, even as it fascinated him. Humanity was cosmically irrelevant, not just small, not just temporary, irrelevant. The universe didn't care. It couldn't care. It was a mechanical process operating according to physical laws that had no consideration for consciousness, meaning, or purpose. But here's what makes Lovecraft's response unique among his contemporaries. He didn't just accept cosmic insignificance philosophically, he weaponized it fictionally. He asked, what if the universe isn't just indifferent? What if the foundation of reality is something worse than indifference? What if existence itself is an accident, a side effect of something that cannot even comprehend what it has created? Cthulhu, created in 1926, is famous because he's graspable, an alien god sleeping beneath the ocean, waiting to wake and destroy humanity. That's a story that has narrative structure, conflict, stakes. But Azathoth, developing in fragments and implications throughout the same period, represents something Lovecraft considered far more terrifying. Not a sleeping god who might wake, but an eternally active chaos that dreams reality into existence without knowing it's dreaming. In letters to Clark Ashton Smith in 1927, Lovecraft wrote that, "The world is indeed comic, but the joke is on mankind." That sentence isn't pessimism, it's theological nihilism. And Azathoth is the punchline. A blind idiot god whose unconscious emanations accidentally created consciousness, which then had the misfortune to recognize its own cosmic irrelevance. Lovecraft didn't invent cosmic horror to scare readers. He invented it to express what he genuinely believed about reality. And Azathoth is that belief in its purest form. But this belief, this entity, didn't emerge from nowhere. It had philosophical ancestors, older traditions that Lovecraft synthesized into something uniquely terrible. Azathoth feels original because it is original in execution. But the philosophical components, the blind creator, the reality is dream, the meaningless cosmos, these ideas have haunted human thought for millennia. Lovecraft didn't create them. He assembled them into something more disturbing than any individual tradition had managed. Start with Gnosticism, the early Christian heresy that refused to die. 2nd century Alexandria. Gnostic texts describe Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, a false god who created the material world while genuinely believing himself to be the supreme deity. Yaldabaoth is powerful but flawed, ignorant of the true divine reality beyond his comprehension. He proclaims, "I am God and there is no other," precisely because he cannot perceive anything greater. The material world is his mistake, a prison for divine sparks of consciousness trapped in flesh. Sound familiar? Lovecraft almost certainly encountered Gnostic ideas through his extensive reading. But where Gnosticism offers escape through gnosis, secret knowledge that frees the spirit from material bondage, Lovecraft offers no escape. Azathoth isn't ignorant of higher reality. There is no higher reality. The blind idiot god is the highest thing. There's nowhere to ascend to. Move forward to 1818. Arthur Schopenhauer publishes The World as Will and Representation, arguing that beneath the surface appearance of reality lies the will, a blind, insatiable force that drives all existence without purpose or goal. The will doesn't think, it doesn't plan, it simply is, churning eternally, creating and destroying without meaning. Individual consciousness is temporary foam on this ocean of meaningless striving. Lovecraft read Schopenhauer. We know this from his letters, and the parallels to Azathoth are impossible to ignore. Replace will with nuclear chaos, and you have the same basic cosmology. Blind force at the foundation, consciousness as accident, existence as purposeless process. But Lovecraft needed a literary bridge, not just philosophical abstraction. He found it in Lord Dunsany, the Irish fantasist whose The Gods of Pagana appeared in 1905. Dunsany's gods are indifferent, capricious, concerned with their own cosmic games while humanity suffers as collateral damage. They don't hate mankind. They barely notice mankind. And when they do notice, it's with the casual interest a child might show toward insects. Lovecraft worshipped Dunsany's prose style and absorbed his theological framework. But again, he darkened it. Dunsany's gods are conscious. They make choices, even if those choices are arbitrary. Azathoth doesn't choose anything. It simply emanates. The horror escalates from indifference to something worse. Absolute unconsciousness at the throne of everything. Then there's Edgar Allan Poe's Eureka, published in 1848. Poe's attempt at cosmology disguised as prose poetry. Poe argues that the universe is God's thought made manifest, that all matter and energy are divine imagination temporarily crystallized into form. When the universal thought completes itself, everything returns to the original unity, creation and destruction as God's breath, inhaling and exhaling reality. Beautiful, right? Lovecraft inverts it. If reality is dream thought, but the dreamer is mindless, then we're not divine imagination made flesh. We're the fever hallucination of an idiot, meaningful, only for as long as the nightmare continues. And when it ends, not through transcendent return to divine unity, but through the dreamer shifting positions, we simply cease as if we had never been. Hindu cosmology offers another parallel. Brahman dreams the universe into existence. Maya, illusion, makes the temporary appear permanent, the dream appear real. When Brahman wakes, the cosmic cycle completes and begins again. But Hindu philosophy includes dharma, karma, purpose within the cycle. Lovecraft strips that away. The cycle isn't purposeful, it's accidental. We're not playing roles in a divine drama. We're noise in the neural static of something that has no neurons. Finally, consider Nietzsche's proclamation in 1882. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. But Nietzsche saw this as liberation, terrible but necessary. Lovecraft saw it as catastrophe, because if God is dead, what's at the center? In Lovecraft's cosmology, what we find at the center isn't absence. It's something worse. Something that was always there, that we mistook for nothing, that turns out to be the worst possible something. These traditions, Gnostic, philosophical, literary, religious, converged in Lovecraft's imagination. But before Azathoth could emerge fully formed, Lovecraft had to name it. And names, in cosmic horror, are never just labels. Names have power, not metaphorical power, actual power in how they shape thought, create associations, build frameworks of understanding. And Azathoth is a name constructed to unsettle before you even know what it refers to. Let's break it down. Azathoth, 4 syllables, harsh consonants, no familiar morphemes. It resists easy pronunciation. Say it out loud right now. Azathoth. Your mouth has to work in slightly uncomfortable ways. The Z and T8 don't flow together naturally in English. The word feels alien on the tongue, which is precisely the point. Lovecraft was obsessed with linguistics. He invented entire languages for his stories, constructed etymologies that sounded plausible even when completely fabricated. For Azathoth, scholars have identified possible influences. The prefix Aza might derive from Arabic, where it can suggest desolation or waste. The suffix Thoth invokes the Egyptian god Thoth, deity of wisdom, writing, and knowledge. But here's the crucial inversion. Thoth represented order, intellect, the careful recording of cosmic law. Azathoth represents the opposite: chaos, mindlessness, the destruction of meaning. If this etymology is intentional, and with Lovecraft that's always uncertain, then Azathoth translates roughly as desolate anti-knowledge, or the waste where wisdom ends. That's not a monster's name. That's a philosophical statement packaged as linguistics. But Lovecraft rarely used the name alone. He built descriptive titles around it, each adding layers of horror. The nuclear chaos. Consider that phrase in historical context. Lovecraft wrote, during the early atomic age, when nuclear suggested fundamental, core, the particle-level structure of reality. But chaos contradicts that. Atoms were supposed to be orderly, predictable, governed by physical laws. Nuclear chaos suggests that at the deepest level, deeper than atoms, deeper than quantum mechanics, reality is disorder, not complex order we don't yet understand. Actual, fundamental chaos. The demon Sultan adds different connotations. Demon, in Greek, means divine power. Not necessarily evil, but definitely otherworldly, beyond human categories of morality. Sultan evokes absolute sovereignty, the ruler whose word is law. But here's the terrible joke. The sovereign is mindless. The Sultan issues no decrees because he cannot think. He rules through sheer existence, not through will. You can't petition this authority. You can't understand its decisions because it makes none. It simply is, and its being determines everything. Then there's the spatial description, dwelling at the center of all infinity. This is geometric horror. A center implies boundaries, edges, a defined space with a middle point. But infinity has no center. Every point in infinite space is equally central and equally peripheral. To place something at the center of infinity is to describe a logical impossibility, and that impossibility is weight-bearing. The throne of Azathoth exists where it cannot exist, which means our concepts of space, position, and location break down before we even approach it. The flute music adds another dimension. Throughout human history, flutes have appeared in religious contexts. Dionysian rituals, shamanic journeys, devotional music. Flutes create trance states, alter consciousness, open doorways. But the flutes around Azathoth aren't worshipful. They're functional. The other gods play not to praise, but to sedate, to maintain the dream state that preserves reality. The music is described as thin, monotonous, and maddening. Not beautiful, not transcendent, just necessary, like a ventilator keeping a comatose patient breathing. Compare Azathoth's nomenclature to Lovecraft's other major entities. Cthulhu sounds alien but suggestive. The Kathit cluster appearing in no human language, marking it as truly other. Yog-Sothoth has that hyphenated structure implying dual nature, the gates and the key. Nyarlathotep rolls off the tongue almost musically, fitting for the only outer god with personality and charm. But Azathoth doesn't suggest anything. It just sits there on the page, ugly and uncomfortable. And the titles surrounding it, Nuclear Chaos, Demon Sultan, Blind Idiot God, escalate from scientific to monarchical to theological language, each adding horror through new frameworks. Lovecraft understood that true cosmic horror requires new language or twisted old language. You cannot express the genuinely alien using comfortable words. The name Azathoth is linguistic assault, forcing your brain to process sounds and concepts that resist processing. And once the name exists, once the linguistic framework is established, the next question becomes, how do you build a mythology around something that shouldn't be mythologized? How do you create narrative structure for something that destroys structure? Here's the paradox Lovecraft faced. How do you create compelling fiction about an entity whose entire purpose is to destroy the possibility of compelling fiction? How do you build mythology for a god that undermines mythology itself? The answer? You don't describe it directly. You build absence. You create negative space. You make your readers fill the void with their own dread. Look at how Azathoth appears across Lovecraft's work, or rather, how it doesn't appear. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926-1927, Azathoth gets mentioned as the ultimate threat, the thing beyond even the gods Randolph Carter encounters. But we never see it. Nyarlathotep threatens to send Carter to the court of Azathoth as punishment, as the worst possible fate. The implication carries all the weight. The actual description is withheld. This is narrative strategy operating at the highest level. Lovecraft learned something crucial. The monster you show becomes manageable. The audience's imagination calibrates. They get used to it. But the monster you only reference, the horror that exists just off-page, forever remains potential. It can be as terrible as each individual reader's mind allows. But strategic absence only works if you build false authority around it. Enter the Necronomicon, the non-existent grimoire that Lovecraft cited so consistently that people still think it's real. The Necronomicon gets quoted describing Azathoth. It gnaws hungrily in chaos beyond time and space. That's all we get. One fragment. One awful image of gnawing. Implying consumption. Implying teeth. Implying hunger in something that shouldn't have any of these qualities. Lovecraft created an entire bibliography of fictional sources. The Necronomicon, written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. The Mnakotic manuscripts. The Book of Ibon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, and he had his writer friends, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Frank Belknap Long, reference these same sources in their own stories. Suddenly you had multiple authors across multiple publications citing the same forbidden texts. The collaborative approach created false verification, the appearance of independent sources confirming the same terrible knowledge. This is myth building using modern media. Ancient mythologies developed through centuries of oral tradition, each retelling adding or changing details until you had rich, contradictory, living traditions. Lovecraft accelerated the process. Within a decade, he and his circle created what looked like an ancient mythology with established texts, conflicting accounts, and progressive revelation across multiple narratives. But here's what separates Lovecraft from later writers who tried to systematize his work. He kept it contradictory. He never wrote a definitive guide to his cosmology. August Derleth, after Lovecraft's death, tried to organize everything into elemental categories: earth, air, fire, water, with corresponding gods in each category. He imposed good versus evil structure, making some entities elder gods fighting against the chaos of the outer gods. Lovecraft would have hated this, because imposed order betrays the core concept. Azathoth doesn't fit in elemental categories. Azathoth isn't fighting anyone. Azathoth isn't even aware enough to fight. The moment you systematize cosmic horror, you domesticate it. You make it manageable. You give audiences a framework to understand it, which means they're no longer properly horrified. Lovecraft kept Azathoth fragmentary across 2 decades of writing, the 1922 fragment, references in Dream Quest, mentions in letters and posthumously published notes. Always peripheral, always implied, never fully present. And this fragmentation is itself thematic. A coherent, fully described entity has boundaries. You can understand where it ends and where you begin. But something that exists only in fragments, in implications, in the spaces between descriptions, that bleeds into everything, that could be anywhere. That might be the underlying reality you're trying not to think about. Compare this to how modern franchises work. Every detail gets explained. Every mystery gets solved. Wikis document every fact. Lovecraft would find this approach fundamentally wrong for cosmic horror. The cosmic should remain incomprehensible not because we don't have enough information, but because human categories of understanding are inadequate to the task. Azathoth succeeds as horror because Lovecraft built absence, cited false authorities, collaborated to create false verification, and refused definitive explanation. The mythology works because it's incomplete. The entity terrifies because it remains fundamentally unknown. And that unknowability isn't just narrative technique. It's philosophical statement about the nature of the entity itself. Which brings us to what Azathoth actually is, or as close as human language can approach the question. All of existence, every galaxy, every atom, every moment of history and dream is the accidental byproduct of Azathoth's eternal idiot dream. Read that again. Let it settle. Because this isn't mythology. This is metaphysics disguised as horror fiction. We are not just insignificant. We are the fever dream of a comatose god who cannot even comprehend the concept of a dream. This is the philosophical engine of Azathoth. The reason it represents something worse than any conscious deity. A malevolent god can be bargained with, appeased, possibly defeated. An indifferent god can be ignored. But a god that dreams reality into existence without knowing it's dreaming, that's a different category of horror entirely. Lovecraft understood something that most horror writers miss. Cosmic insignificance is scary, but cosmic contingency is terrifying. Insignificance means you don't matter much. Contingency means you might not matter at all. That your existence depends on conditions so arbitrary, so fragile, that the word existence itself becomes suspect. Think about the standard religious cosmology. A conscious creator makes deliberate choices. Let there be light. That's intention. That's will. Even if the creator is cruel, even if the creation is flawed, there's agency involved. Humanity exists because something wanted humanity to exist. That provides meaning, even if the meaning is we're divine entertainment, or we're a moral test. At least we're here on purpose. Azathoth destroys that framework completely. There is no purpose. There is no design. There is only a mindless nuclear chaos that happens through the sheer accident of its existence to generate reality as a side effect. We're not even a failed experiment. We're computational noise in a process that has no computation. This is anti-teleology elevated to theology. Teleology is the philosophical study of purpose, of final causes, of the question, what is this for? Every major religious tradition has teleological components. The universe exists for a reason. Humanity has a role to play. Suffering serves a function. History moves towards something, even if that something is incomprehensible. Lovecraft says, no, there is no for. There is only is. And even is contingent on something that cannot maintain stable being. Compare this to existentialism, which was developing simultaneously in Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. Sartre would later write, "Existence precedes essence. We exist first, then create meaning through our choices." Camus would explore the absurd, the disconnect between humanity's need for meaning and the universe's refusal to provide it. But both philosophers, for all their bleakness, maintained that human consciousness can create authentic meaning, even in a meaningless cosmos. Lovecraft denies even this, because if consciousness itself is an accident, if thought is a glitch in mindless process, then our attempts to create meaning are themselves meaningless. We're not heroes rebelling against an absurd universe. We're fleeting patterns in chaos, briefly self-aware before dissolution. The dream reality framework makes it worse. In standard materialism, the physical universe exists independently. It may be meaningless, but it's at least stable. Stars will burn according to physical laws, whether humans observe them or not. But if reality is Azathoth's dream, then physical law is just dream logic, consistent until it isn't. The universe doesn't operate by rules. It operates by the unconscious emanations of something that cannot maintain coherent thought. Lovecraft called this cosmicism in his letters, not nihilism. Nihilism implies the deliberate rejection of meaning. Cosmicism implies that meaning was never available to reject. The universe is neither hostile nor friendly. It's not even indifferent, because indifference implies awareness of what you're ignoring. The universe is non-cognitive. It doesn't rise to the level of caring enough to not care. And consciousness? Consciousness is the aberration. Most of the universe is dust, radiation, empty space. Consciousness requires incredibly specific conditions: the right planet, the right chemistry, the right evolutionary pressures, and even then, it's temporary. Stars will outlast every thought ever thought by billions of years. The universe's default state is mindlessness. We're the exception that briefly interrupts the rule. Azathoth embodies this reality, a mindless god ruling mindless cosmos, with consciousness as a temporary glitch in eternal stupidity. That's the philosophical core. That's what makes this entity different from every other deity in fiction. But a concept needs a structure. A theology needs a court. Even a mindless god needs attendants. And those attendants serve the most desperate function imaginable. His court is a maelstrom of lesser outer gods and formless dancers, the so-called other gods, who circle him, playing monotonous, maddening flute music. They do not worship. They do not advise. Their sole, desperate function is to lull him, to keep the dream steady, to prevent the nuclear chaos from shifting. This is hierarchy without meaning. This is cosmic governance as cosmic sedation. Let's map the structure, because understanding who's who reveals the full horror of Lovecraft's metaphysics. At the center, if center can apply to something beyond spatial location, sits Azathoth, the source, the blind idiot god, the nuclear chaos, the thing that cannot think but from which all thinking accidentally derives. Around Azathoth swirl the outer gods. These are not servants in the traditional sense. They're not worshippers who chose devotion. They're trapped in perpetual function, bound to their roles by cosmic necessity. They pipe, they dance, They maintain the acoustic environment that keeps Azathoth in its dreaming state. And they do this not out of love or fear, but because if they stop, everything ends. Think about that dynamic. The most powerful entities in Lovecraft's cosmos, beings that transcend space and time, beings that human minds cannot properly perceive, and they're essentially cosmic nurses maintaining a patient who must never wake. That's not dignified. That's not glorious. That's eternal, desperate maintenance of catastrophic fragility. Among the outer gods, one stands apart, Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, called the soul and messenger of the outer gods. And here's where the hierarchy gets genuinely strange. Nyarlathotep is the only outer god with personality, with agency, with something resembling consciousness and will. He can communicate, he can deceive. He takes forms and walks among humans, spreading madness deliberately rather than accidentally. Why does this matter? Because it reveals the inversion at the heart of cosmic horror. In traditional theology, God is the most conscious being. Lesser angels have diminished consciousness. Humans, even less. Animals, less still. Consciousness decreases as you move away from the divine center. But in Lovecraft's cosmology, the center is mindless. The supreme being is the least conscious. And consciousness increases as you move away from the throne, reaching its peak in entities like Nyarlathotep, who serve the mindless center while possessing the awareness to understand what they are doing. That makes consciousness not a divine attribute, but a curse. The more aware you are, the more you comprehend the horror of what you're maintaining. Nyarlathotep knows. He understands that reality is Azathoth's dream. And he continues anyway, playing his role. Because what choice exists? The alternative is cessation. Then there are the great old ones, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and others. These beings are powerful beyond human comprehension, but they're derivative. They exist within the dream, not as its source. Cthulhu sleeps in R'lyeh, waiting for the stars to align properly so he can wake and reclaim Earth. That implies temporality, cause and effect, conditions that must be met. Azathoth has none of these limitations because Azathoth doesn't operate by rules. It emanates rules as unconscious byproduct. Yog-Sothoth comes closest to Azathoth in the hierarchy. Described as the gate and the key, Yog-Sothoth exists simultaneously at all points in space and time, past, present, future, all accessible to this entity. In some interpretations, Yog-Sothoth is Azathoth's awareness, the conscious knowing split off from the unconscious being. If accurate, this means even Azathoth's consciousness doesn't belong to Azathoth. The blind idiot god cannot even possess its own self-awareness. The pipers and dancers surrounding the throne deserve special attention. Lovecraft describes them as amorphous, without fixed form. They exist only for function, to produce the flute music that maintains the dream. They're not beings with identity, they're processes. They're cosmic mechanisms wearing the appearance of entities, and the music itself, described as thin, monotonous, maddening, playing in measureless mad spaces. Not beautiful, not worshipful, just functionally necessary. The universe continues because something plays an eternal lullaby for an idiot god. Remove the music, and the dreamer shifts. And if the dreamer shifts, pause here. Because what happens when Azathoth stirs isn't just the end of the world. It's the end of having ever been a world. The retroactive deletion of existence. But before we examine that cessation, we need to understand how humans interact with this system when they're unlucky enough to become aware of it. If the music ever stops, If Azathoth stirs, even slightly toward wakefulness, the dream ends. And with it, everything, not with fire or ice or conquest, with simple, absolute cessation, as if it had never been. This is the ultimate cosmic horror. Not that we live in a hostile universe, but that we live in a fragile one, contingent upon the perpetual sedation of a mindless, chaotic heart at the center of all things. So, what happens to humans who learn this? What does this knowledge do to consciousness that becomes aware of its own cosmic status, madness? But not the Hollywood kind, not the dramatic breakdown with visible symptoms. Something worse, epistemic collapse, the destruction of the basic cognitive frameworks that allow you to process reality. Let me explain what I mean. Your brain builds models. It takes sensory input and constructs coherent narratives. I exist. The world exists. My actions have consequences. Tomorrow will probably happen. These aren't philosophical positions you consciously defend. They're the operating system running below conscious thought. You need them to function, to make decisions, to maintain identity across time. Learning about Azathoth, truly comprehending what it means, attacks the operating system. Because if reality is Azathoth's accidental dream, then I exist becomes I momentarily appear to exist as a fleeting pattern in chaos. The world exists becomes what I perceive as the world is an unconscious emanation subject to cessation without warning or cause. My actions have consequences becomes my actions are ephemeral ripples in a dream that may not continue long enough for consequences to manifest. These aren't new beliefs replacing old beliefs. This is the framework for holding any beliefs at all coming apart. In Lovecraft's stories, characters who encounter cosmic truth don't just go crazy, they fragment. Randolph Carter, in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, progresses toward revelation across the entire narrative. The closer he gets to Azathoth's court, the less coherent his perceptions become. Space stops behaving consistently. Time becomes negotiable. Identity blurs. And when he's finally rescued, not by his own agency, but by random cosmic accident, he doesn't remember what he saw. His mind retroactively deleted the experience as an immune system might delete invasive code. That's protective madness, the consciousness saving itself by refusing to process information that would destroy it. You don't go insane because you're weak. You go insane because sanity cannot accommodate cosmic truth and maintain function. The dreamer paradox makes it worse. If human consciousness is a derivative product of Azathoth's unconscious emanations, then we're not autonomous beings who happen to exist in a harsh universe. We're content within a larger unconsciousness. Our thoughts are Azathoth's neural static. Our sense of self is a localized pattern briefly achieving complexity before dissolution. This isn't metaphor. Within Lovecraft's framework, this is literal metaphysics. You are not separate from Azathoth. You are a temporary configuration of the same substance. When mystics speak of all is one, they usually mean something comforting: universal love, cosmic connection, the dissolution of boundaries leading to transcendence. Lovecraft inverts this. All is one, yes. And that one is mindless chaos. Your deepest identity is nothing recognizable as identity at all. Characters in Lovecraft's fiction who glimpse this truth respond in different ways. Some commit suicide immediately, recognizing that non-existence is preferable to existing as an accident. Others retreat into catatonia, their minds simply stopping rather than continuing to process unbearable information. A few, like the protagonist of The Whisperer in Darkness, have their consciousness extracted from their bodies entirely, stored in cylinders, sent across the cosmos to witness alien perspectives, existence as horror, awareness as torture. But most humans never encounter Azathoth at all, even indirectly. They live and die in protective ignorance. They believe in meaning, purpose, coherent selfhood. And this ignorance isn't weakness. It's the only way consciousness can function. The scholar's curse in Lovecraft's cosmos is that intelligence and curiosity lead inevitably toward truths that intelligence cannot survive. Randolph Carter's journey represents this trajectory. He starts seeking cosmic knowledge, believing that understanding will bring power or transcendence. Instead, he finds that the most profound knowledge available is the knowledge that everything is accidental, temporary, and meaningless. That's not the kind of knowledge that enlightens, it's the kind that erases. So, how does this forbidden knowledge actually spread? What happens when someone encounters the information that should never be encountered? That requires examining the sources, the texts, the gateways to revelation. This answers, why? Is there something instead of nothing? With the most horrifying answer possible. Because something infinitely stupid and chaotic is having a nightmare, and we are in it. That sentence should disturb you more than any description of tentacles or teeth. Because it's an answer to the fundamental question of philosophy, the question Leibniz posed in 1697, the question Heidegger called the most important inquiry possible. Why is there something rather than nothing? Every major philosophical and religious tradition has offered answers. God created because creation is an expression of divine nature. The universe exists because existence is metaphysically necessary. Being emerges from non-being through dialectical process. The quantum vacuum spontaneously generates particle pairs. These answers vary in complexity and plausibility, but they share something crucial. They suggest that existence has some kind of foundation, some reason for being, even if that reason is, no reason is, necessary. Lovecraft's answer through Azathoth is worse. Existence is accidental, but not accident in the sense of random quantum fluctuation or unplanned but stable outcome. Accident in the sense of temporary side effect of a process that could cease at any moment for no reason. The Necronomicon, Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, supposedly contains the most complete human knowledge of Azathoth. Abdul al-Hazred, the mad Arab who allegedly wrote it, describes Azathoth as gnawing hungrily in chaos beyond time and space. That single image carries profound implications. Gnawing suggests consumption, suggests hunger, suggests incompleteness. The thing at the center of everything is not satisfied. It consumes even as it emanates. It's not stable. It's active chaos, constantly churning. But the Necronomicon is also a cautionary device in Lovecraft's fiction. Characters who read it too deeply don't gain power. They gain knowledge that destroys the possibility of stable existence. They learn things that cannot be integrated into human consciousness without fragmenting that consciousness irreparably. What specifically does the knowledge do? Let's examine the mechanism of epistemic collapse. First stage, astronomy's horror. Characters in Lovecraft's stories often begin their descent through telescopic observation. They look at the stars, calculate distances, comprehend the scale of the cosmos. Earth is not the center. The sun is ordinary. The galaxy is one among billions. And in that vastness, patterns appear that shouldn't appear. Geometries that violate Euclidean space. Angles that hurt to perceive. This is observational knowledge destroying the observer. Second stage, mathematical proofs. Several Lovecraft stories reference equations or geometries that point toward Azathoth's throne. These aren't metaphorical mathematics. Within the fiction, they're real mathematical operations that, when completed, reveal structural impossibilities in reality itself. Imagine proving through rigorous logic that logic cannot be rigorous. That's the territory these scholars enter. They demonstrate mathematically that mathematics has no stable foundation because the substrate of reality has no stable foundation. Third stage, dream research. Randolph Carter's explorations in the dreamlands represent this approach. He discovers that the boundary between waking and dreaming is porous, that some dreams are more real than waking life, that reality is itself a kind of shared dream. And if you follow the dream logic far enough, you reach the source, the dreamer who dreams everything, including itself, without knowing it's dreaming. The flute music functions as non-linguistic information transmission. Several characters in Lovecraft's stories hear the piping from Azathoth's court and go mad not from the sound itself, but from what the sound communicates. It's not music in the aesthetic sense. It's data. It's the cosmic operating system made audible, and human minds aren't designed to process that data stream. They fragment under the load. Sanity in this framework isn't moral or cognitive strength. It's functional limitation. Your brain filters reality, shows you a simplified version you can navigate. Sanity is the filter working properly. Madness is the filter breaking, letting through unprocessed cosmic data that consciousness cannot organize into coherent experience. This inverts Enlightenment values completely. Since the 17th century, Western philosophy has treated knowledge as liberating. Sapere aude, dare to know, Kant's motto for the Enlightenment. The assumption is that truth, however difficult, is ultimately better than ignorance. That reality, however harsh, should be faced. Lovecraft rejects this. Some truths don't liberate, they destroy. And the truth about Azathoth is the worst of these, not because it's false, but because it's real. And reality cannot be borne by consciousness that evolved to navigate a much smaller, more stable-seeming world. You are a fleeting thought in a mind that cannot think. And the only thing keeping you here is a terrible, endless flute song, played in the dark, by things that pray their God never, ever listens. But knowing about Azathoth philosophically is one thing. Encountering it in actual narrative, in the stories Lovecraft wrote, that's when the abstract horror becomes concrete. When concepts become texts, when philosophy becomes literature. And that's where we go next. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Lovecraft opened the door to Azathoth in 1922 with a fragment so unstable he couldn't finish it. The story, titled simply Azathoth, runs barely 3 pages before stopping mid-sentence, as if the act of writing further would breach some threshold even the author couldn't cross. The fragment describes an unnamed protagonist drawn by a vague, insistent impulse to seek cosmic knowledge. He abandons normal life, retreats to a garret room, and begins perceiving things beyond standard reality. He hears flute music, wild and liquid, coming from impossible directions. Space starts behaving incorrectly. Geometry becomes negotiable. And then, mid-paragraph, the text simply stops. Why? Lovecraft never explained. But the fragment establishes everything Azathoth would become. The flute music, the spatial distortion, the progression from ordinary perception towards something consciousness cannot process. It's less a story than a diagram, a template for cosmic horror that Lovecraft would elaborate for the rest of his life. But Azathoth didn't appear in vacuum. Lovecraft had been building toward this entity through earlier works that established cosmic dread without naming its source. The Nameless City, written in 1921, describes ancient ruins predating human civilization, containing inscriptions about beings that came down from the stars. No Azathoth yet, but the cosmological framework is forming. Humanity as recent arrival in a cosmos fair, older and stranger than religious tradition suggests. The Hound, completed in 1922, introduces the Necronomicon. Two decadent grave robbers steal an amulet from a tomb and are subsequently hunted by something they cannot escape. The story mentions the wisdom of Abdul al-Hazred, the mad Arab whose grimoire supposedly contains knowledge of cosmic entities. The Necronomicon would become Lovecraft's primary vehicle for introducing Azathoth-related lore across multiple stories, creating false scholarly apparatus that made fiction feel like research. Throughout the 1920s, Azathoth appears in fragments, always peripheral, never centered. Letters to Clark Ashton Smith and Frank Belknap Long reference the entity as the ultimate cosmic horror, worse than anything they depicted in published fiction. These letters functioned as world building, establishing Azathoth's centrality through discussion rather than direct narrative depiction. The Fungi from Yuggoth sonnet cycle, written in Suezinozdom 1929 to 1930, contains multiple oblique Azathoth references. Sonnet 21, titled Nyarlathotep, describes the messenger of the outer gods leading humanity toward the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space. Not detailed description, allusion, implication, the threat of revelation without the revelation itself. This strategy of dispersed reference creates cumulative dread. Each story adds one detail. Each letter clarifies one aspect. Each poem contributes one image. Readers piecing together the mythology from scattered sources experience discovery as investigation, as if assembling forbidden knowledge from fragments deliberately kept separate. This mimics how occult traditions actually work. Information scattered across grimoires, oral traditions, cryptic symbols, never consolidated because consolidation is dangerous. Lovecraft's circle of writers participated deliberately. Robert E. Howard referenced Azathoth in his stories. Clark Ashton Smith included mentions in his Hyperborean cycle. August Derleth, even during Lovecraft's lifetime, began incorporating the entity into his own fiction. This collaborative approach created false verification, multiple authors independently confirming the same cosmology, making it feel discovered rather than invented. The progression across texts is strategic. Early stories establish that the cosmos is old and strange. Middle period stories introduce entities and grimoires. Later stories connect everything into a coherent, if deliberately incomplete, mythology with Azathoth as unspoken center. By the time readers encounter direct Azathoth material in Dream Quest or Through the Gates of the Silver Key, they've been prepared through dozens of peripheral mentions. The foundation is laid before the structure appears. Compare this to how Cthulhu emerged. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, is a complete revelation. Backstory, description, mythology, all in one story. You finish that story knowing what Cthulhu is, what it wants, how it operates. But Azathoth never gets that treatment. Azathoth remains scattered, partial, deliberately fragmented across Lovecraft's entire corpus. This fragmentation is thematic. A coherent entity has boundaries. Azathoth, as mindless chaos, shouldn't have boundaries. The literary strategy mirrors the metaphysical reality. The entity that cannot be coherently thought about should not be coherently written about. So when Lovecraft finally brings readers closest to Azathoth in sustained narrative, he does so through dream logic and spatial impossibility. He does so through the dream quest of unknown Kadath. And that journey deserves extremely close examination. Randolph Carter wants to find a city he saw in dreams. That's the premise. Simple, almost fairy tale simple. But the journey transforms into something else entirely, a progression toward cosmic truth that Carter doesn't understand he's pursuing until it's almost too late. Written between 1926 and 1927, but unpublished until after Lovecraft's death, Dream Quest operates as both fantasy adventure and philosophical horror. Carter travels through the dreamlands, a dimension accessible through sleep, seeking the sunset city he glimpsed once and cannot relocate. He believes the gods of Earth's dreamlands are hiding the city from him. He wants answers. He wants access. He gets answers. They're worse than ignorance. The narrative structure is deceptive. For most of the story, we're in recognizable fantasy territory. Carter visits strange cities, befriends ghouls, sails seas that don't exist in waking geography, climbs mountains that lead to other dimensions. The prose is dreamlike, flowing, almost hypnotic. Lovecraft indulges in elaborate description, architectural details, exotic creatures, impossible vistas. It feels like adventure fiction, but the destinations keep escalating. First, Carter seeks the gods of Earth. He finds them on Kadath, a castle of onyx in the cold waste. But these gods are absent. They've abandoned their proper realm. Why? Because they heard about something more interesting. Carter's Sunset City, which they claimed for themselves. And where are they now? With Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, the messenger of the outer gods. Notice the hierarchy revealing itself. Carter thinks he's investigating gods, but Earth's gods are powerless, subject to the whims of Nyarlathotep, who himself serves the outer gods, who themselves maintain Azathoth. Each level of the investigation reveals another layer of cosmic authority, each layer more terrible than the last. Nyarlathotep appears to Carter directly, and this is where the fantasy adventure curdles into cosmic horror. The crawling chaos offers Carter exactly what he wants: transportation to the Sunset City, immediately, no further searching required. But there's a condition. Carter must go as Nyarlathotep's guest, through Nyarlathotep's preferred route, through spaces that shouldn't exist, past guardians that protect, reality from what lies beyond, toward the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space. The description of this journey is Lovecraft at his most disorienting. Space stops behaving. Carter loses sense of direction, of duration, of bodily position. He perceives geometries that his mind cannot process. He hears the flute music, thin, monotonous whine of accursed flutes, coming from everywhere and nowhere. He's being taken to Azathoth's court, not as punishment, but as entertainment for Nyarlathotep, who finds human suffering amusing. At the threshold of absolute revelation, Carter is saved by intervention he didn't earn. The night gaunts, creatures he befriended earlier, snatch him from Nyarlathotep's grasp and carry him back towards safer dimensions. He doesn't escape through heroism or wisdom. He escapes through accident, through cosmic indifference, working briefly in his favor instead of against him. And when he wakes, because the entire journey was dream travel, making the boundary between real and unreal deliberately uncertain, he finds that his Sunset City was Boston, his childhood home. The cosmic mystery he pursued across dimensions was memory, idealized and unreachable not because gods hid it, but because the past cannot be recovered. This ending operates on multiple levels. Superficially, it's about nostalgia, about childhood wonder lost to adult knowledge. But deeper, Carter's journey toward cosmic truth nearly destroyed him, and the truth he sought was personal, not cosmic. The real cosmic truth, Azathoth's court, the nuclear chaos, the fundamental reality underlying everything, that truth he only brushed against, and that brief contact almost annihilated his consciousness. The narrative structure mirrors epistemic collapse. The coherent fantasy adventure progressively fragments. Descriptions become less reliable. Causation becomes uncertain. Carter's agency diminishes until he's completely passive, carried by forces he cannot resist toward, a destination he cannot survive. The story stops making conventional sense because it's depicting the approach towards something that makes conventional sense impossible. Lovecraft never describes Azathoth directly in this story. Carter doesn't see the throne, doesn't perceive the entity itself. He hears the flutes. He senses the wrongness. He approaches the boundary. And that's sufficient for horror. The near miss more terrifying than direct confrontation, because direct confrontation would require description, and description would limit the horror to describable terms. Dream Quest demonstrates how Azathoth functions best in narrative, as destination never reached, as threat perpetually approaching, as the terrible answer to questions that should never be asked. But Lovecraft wasn't finished with Randolph Carter, or with exploring what happens when consciousness ventures too close to cosmic truth. The Whisperer in Darkness, published in 1930, approaches Azathoth from a different angle, not through dream travel, but through physical evidence and alien testimony. The story follows Albert Wilmarth, a folklore professor who investigates reports of strange creatures in Vermont's wilderness. These reports turn out to be real. The creatures are the Mygo, fungoid aliens from Yog-Sothoth, Pluto, who have colonized Earth in limited numbers. And they possess knowledge, cosmic knowledge, knowledge about the universe's true structure. A colleague of Wilmarth's, Henry Akeley, claims to have established communication with the Mygo. They've shared information with him, information about entities that exist beyond human comprehension. The Mygo can surgically remove human brains, preserve them in cylinders, and transport those consciousnesses across space to witness alien perspectives directly. Akeley supposedly volunteers for this procedure. He wants to see what exists beyond Earth's narrow experiential boundaries. The story's climax reveals that Akeley is already gone. The Mygo have been impersonating him, using recorded voice and a lifelike mask. They want Wilmarth's brain too. They want to add another consciousness to their collection, another perspective to experience what humans should not experience. Azathoth appears only in overheard conversation, the Mygo discussing cosmic entities among themselves, mentioning the Lord of all at the center of infinity. But this peripheral reference carries weight precisely because it comes from aliens. These aren't humans driven mad by revelation. These are beings for whom cosmic truth is ordinary knowledge, discussable, matter of fact. And even they speak of Azathoth with something resembling caution. Through the Gates of the Silver Key, written in 1932-33 as collaboration with E. Hoffman Price, continues Randolph Carter's story and brings him as close to Azathoth as any character gets while maintaining identity. Carter, still seeking ultimate knowledge, uses the Silver Key, a mystical artifact, to travel beyond time and space entirely. He doesn't journey through space to distant locations. He transcends dimensional limitations altogether. And in that state of expanded consciousness, he learns what he is. He's not one being. He's a temporary facet of a being that exists across all time simultaneously. His human life, his personality, his memories. These are local phenomena, like a single wave believing itself separate from the ocean. The larger being exists in dimensions human consciousness cannot properly model. And that larger being exists within the dream of Azathoth. The revelation destroys Carter's sense of individual identity. He can still access the memories of being human, but he knows those memories are partial, are misleadingly coherent, are the way infinite existence appears when filtered through the narrow perceptual apparatus of three-dimensional consciousness. This is Lovecraft's most direct confrontation with the implications of Azathoth's dream reality. If everything is Azathoth's unconscious emanation, then individual identity is illusion. You are not separate. You are a localized pattern in larger chaos, briefly achieving enough complexity to mistake yourself for an autonomous entity. Carter technically survives this revelation, but survive is questionable. His consciousness expands beyond human boundaries. He can inhabit other forms, other perspectives, other time periods, but he's no longer Randolph Carter in any meaningful sense. The personality that began seeking cosmic knowledge has been dissolved by achieving it. The pattern across these stories is consistent: investigation leading to revelation, leading to annihilation. Characters who pursue cosmic knowledge don't gain power, they lose coherence. The closer you get to ultimate truth, the less you exists to understand it. The Pnakotic manuscripts, mentioned across multiple stories, supposedly contain the oldest human knowledge of the outer gods. These texts predate Egypt, predate Sumeria, date back to Hyperborea and Mu and other civilizations that rose and fell before recorded history. And they're fragmentary, corrupted, partially destroyed, whether by accident or by deliberate suppression, remains ambiguous. This textual strategy, ancient sources partially preserved, serves narrative function. Complete knowledge would destroy narrative tension. But fragmentary knowledge allows progressive revelation across stories. Each new text discovered adds one piece. Each archaeological find clarifies one detail. Readers assemble understanding the way characters do, gradually, incompletely, with mounting dread. Lovecraft's narrative approach embodies his philosophy. The cosmos resists human understanding, not because understanding is prohibited, but because human categories cannot accommodate cosmic reality. The stories don't withhold information to maintain mystery. They withhold information because full information would require consciousness that no longer qualifies as human. And after Lovecraft's death, other writers tried to continue his work. Some understood what made it work. Many did not. The expansions, collaborations, and betrayals of Lovecraft's vision deserve their own examination. August Derleth loved Lovecraft's work. He also fundamentally misunderstood it. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth became the primary custodian of his literary estate. He published Lovecraft's unpublished manuscripts. He completed Lovecraft's story fragments. He promoted Lovecraft's work to new audiences. And he systematized the cosmology in ways that betrayed its core philosophy. Derleth saw Lovecraft's entities as a pantheon, similar to Greek or Norse gods. He created elemental categories: Cthulhu as water entity, Hastur as air entity, and so forth. He imposed moral structure, dividing cosmic beings into evil outer gods and good elder gods who opposed them. He wrote stories where human cultists could summon entities through rituals and where investigators could banish entities through counter-rituals. This is everything Lovecraft opposed. Lovecraft's cosmos has no moral structure. His entities aren't good or evil. They're beyond such categories. They can't be summoned through ritual because they don't care about human ritual. They can't be banished because they're not invasive forces. They're fundamental reality, and you can't banish reality. Derleth's Azathoth becomes a villain, an enemy, something to fight. In Derleth's stories, elder gods actively oppose Azathoth and the outer gods, protecting humanity from complete annihilation. This transforms cosmic horror into cosmic drama, still dark, still dangerous, but fundamentally comprehensible. There are good guys and bad guys. There's conflict with potential resolution. Lovecraft would have hated this, because the whole point of Azathoth is that it cannot be opposed. It's not trying to do anything. It simply is, and its being accidentally generates reality. You can't fight the ground you stand on. You can't oppose the conditions that allow opposition to exist. But Derleth's systematization influenced decades of later writers. The Cthulhu mythos, as codified entity, comes largely from Derleth's organizational work. Later writers inherited his framework without always recognizing it wasn't Lovecraft's framework. Lynn Carter, writing in the 1970s, expanded the mythological timeline, detailing wars between elder gods and outer gods spanning billions of years. Ramsey Campbell created new entities following Lovecraftian naming conventions, but often with more defined purposes and characteristics. Brian Lumley wrote the Titus Crow series, where a protagonist directly opposes the outer gods using magical knowledge. Pure heroic fantasy wearing cosmic horror aesthetics. These expansions aren't without value. Campbell's work, especially his early stories, captures Lovecraftian dread effectively. Lumley's novels are entertaining, adventure fiction, but they drift from the philosophical core that makes Azathoth genuinely horrifying. They make the cosmic manageable, which defeats the purpose. More recent writers have understood this problem. Thomas Ligotti's horror fiction embraces Lovecraftian nihilism without direct mythos references. His stories depict consciousness as curse, existence as horror, awareness as the only real tragedy. This is cosmicism without the cosmology, the philosophy extracted and refined. Laird Barron's stories return to Lovecraft's remote locations and investigative structures, but maintain ambiguity about what's really happening. Characters encounter something, but whether it's mythos entity, psychological breakdown, or unreliable narration remains deliberately uncertain. The horror comes from epistemological collapse, not monster encounters. The video game Bloodborne, 2015, captures Azathoth's essence better than most literary adaptations. The moon presence that appears in the EAN game's true ending is a cosmic entity that has been manipulating the entire narrative. It's incomprehensible, exists beyond a normal space, and the protagonist's victory against it is ambiguous. Defeating it might just mean becoming it, absorbing its cosmic role. The game's insight mechanic, where gaining knowledge literally changes what you perceive, directly models Lovecraftian epistemic horror. Tabletop RPGs face an interesting challenge with Azathoth. Call of Cthulhu game needs statistics for entities, needs combat mechanics, needs rules for interaction. But how do you stat the unstatable? The game's solution. Azathoth has no combat statistics. Encountering it ends the game immediately. All characters die. Reality dissolves. This is the only mechanically honest approach. Some entities cannot be incorporated into gameplay without destroying the framework that makes gameplay possible. What remains consistent across successful adaptations is absence. Works that understand, Lovecraft keep Azathoth off page, maintain ambiguity, refuse complete revelation. Works that fail bring the entity on stage, show it clearly, make it defeatable. The moment you can see Azathoth completely, it stops being Azathoth. The entity works through implication, through absence, through the terror of approaching something that cannot be approached. That's why it endures. That's why it spreads beyond Lovecraft into culture, psychology, philosophy, and collective anxiety. And that cultural afterlife demands examination. You do not learn the origin of Azathoth. You learn that you are the origin. You are a fleeting thought in a mind that cannot think. That's philosophy. That's fiction. But here's what gets disturbing. People started treating it as something else, as occult fact, as hidden knowledge accidentally published as horror stories, as truth disguised as entertainment. The Simon Necronomicon appeared in 1977, published by Schlangekraft Inc. Beards, edited by someone calling himself Simon. It claimed to be the actual grimoire Lovecraft referenced, the book of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, containing genuine rituals for contacting cosmic entities. It provided invocations, sigils, ceremonial instructions. It treated Lovecraft's invented mythology as Sumerian religion incompletely understood by modern scholars. The book is complete fabrication. Abdul al-Hazred never existed. The Necronomicon never existed. Lovecraft invented both explicitly as fictional devices. He said this in letters. He told people directly. But the Simon Necronomicon sold thousands of copies to people who believed, or wanted to believe, that Lovecraft had stumbled onto actual occult knowledge and published it as fiction for plausible deniability. Why does this happen? Why do people want cosmic horror to be real? Chaos magic offers one answer. In the 1970s and 80s, occultists like Peter Carroll began incorporating Lovecraft's entities into practical magical systems. Carroll's Liber Null explicitly discusses Azathoth, but renames it Kia, the primal void, the undifferentiated chaos preceding manifestation. Chaos magicians argue that belief is a tool. If fictional entities work in ritual practice, if they produce results, then the distinction between real and fictional becomes operationally meaningless. This is philosophically interesting even if you don't believe in magic, because it asks, what makes a god real? Traditional answer, a god is real if it exists independently of human belief. Chaos magic answer, a god is real if it produces effects when invoked, regardless of ontological status. Azathoth works ritually for chaos magicians not because the entity objectively exists, but because the concept is potent enough to organize consciousness in useful ways. Then there are the clinical cases. Psychiatric literature contains scattered reports of patients experiencing delusions involving Lovecraftian entities. Paranoid schizophrenia patients describing the flute, music, describing geometric impossibilities, describing the sense that reality is dream state maintained by external forces. These cases are rare but documented. Are these patients actually perceiving cosmic truth? Almost certainly not. More likely, they've encountered Lovecraft's work, and their pattern recognition systems, malfunctioning due to neurological conditions, have incorporated mythos imagery into delusional frameworks. But the fact that Lovecraft's philosophical horror maps onto certain psychotic experiences suggests he was describing something recognizable, even if not literally true. The phenomenology of consciousness dissolving, of reality becoming uncertain, of meaning collapsing. These are real experiences, however we interpret their causes. The internet amplified these crossovers between fiction and belief. Creepypasta traditions, SCP Foundation collaborative writing, various ARGs, all blur boundaries between story and reality deliberately. The Holders series presents cosmic entities in list format, instructions for encountering terrible objects with terrible guardians. The SCP Foundation catalogs anomalous entities using clinical language that makes fiction feel like classified documentation. Azathoth appears throughout these formats, sometimes named directly, sometimes present as obvious influence. The appeal is consistent. These stories tap into the horror of reality being less stable than we assume, of consciousness being less reliable than we need it to be, of the cosmic order being contingent rather than necessary. Even astronomy contributes to the mythology becoming metaphor for real phenomena. Sagittarius A, the supermassive black hole at our galaxy's center, gets compared to Azathoth. It's a gravitational singularity where physics breaks down, where space-time curvature becomes infinite, where the normal rules governing reality cease to function. Calling it Azathoth is obviously metaphorical. Black holes aren't conscious, aren't dreaming reality into existence. But the metaphor resonates. There is something at the center that operates by different rules, that would destroy anything approaching too closely, that fundamentally shapes the structure of everything orbiting it. Timothy Leary's Cosmic Coincidence Control Center concept merges psychedelic experience with Lovecraftian dread. Leary proposed that high-dose psychedelic states reveal an intelligence, or pseudo-intelligence, managing reality's apparent coincidences. Whether this intelligence is conscious, whether it cares, whether it's even real, or just pattern recognition gone haywire, Leary deliberately left ambiguous. But the framework is Lovecraftian, something vast operating beyond human comprehension, something we're embedded within rather than separate from. Conspiracy theory culture absorbs Lovecraft too. David Icke and others reference reptilian entities, archons, cosmic parasites feeding on human consciousness, all drawing from the same well of anxiety about reality being controlled by incomprehensible forces. Fiction becomes folklore, becomes metaphor, becomes lens for interpreting genuine uncertainty. And that lens gets applied everywhere, in cinema, in games, in music, in every medium trying to express what cannot be directly expressed. Azathoth has never appeared in a major film, and there's a reason it's unfilmable. Not difficult to film, not technically challenging. Unfilmable in the sense that direct cinematic depiction would betray the concept. You cannot show what should not be shown. You cannot make visible what operates through invisibility. The moment a special effects team designs Azathoth, gives it shape and color and movement, they've made it manageable. They've made it something you can look at and survive looking at. Stuart Gordon's Lovecraft adaptations, Reanimator, From Beyond, Dagon, understand this principle. They adapt Lovecraft's stories, but keep cosmic elements mostly off-screen. From Beyond features the Resonator, a device that allows perception of creatures existing in adjacent dimensions. These creatures are shown briefly, disturbingly, but the film's real horror comes from the epistemological collapse. The realization that invisible entities have always been present, feeding, watching. The Call of Cthulhu, 2005, the silent film adaptation by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, comes closest to successful mythos cinema by embracing limitation. Shot as 1920s silent film, it uses miniatures, obvious effects, deliberate artificiality. Cthulhu appears, but rendered in ways that acknowledge the impossibility of adequate representation. The film succeeds by admitting what it cannot do. Video games handle Azathoth more successfully because interactivity creates different possibilities. Bloodborne, 2015, never names Azathoth, but includes the moon presence, a cosmic entity whose true nature is revealed only to players who meet specific conditions. The moon presence has been manipulating the entire narrative. The good ending involves defeating it, but defeating it might mean becoming it, absorbing its role as cosmic overseer. The game's insight mechanic, where knowledge changes perception, directly models Lovecraftian epistemic horror. High insight reveals enemies that were always present but invisible, changes NPC dialogue, alters the environment. The more you know, the worse reality becomes. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, implements a sanity meter tracking psychological deterioration. As sanity decreases, the game lies to players. Fake deaths, false game over screens, apparent glitches that are actually in-game events. This breaks the boundary between character experience and player experience. You're not just watching a character go mad. You, the player, are experiencing unreliable reality. Tabletop RPGs face unique challenges. Call of Cthulhu needs game mechanics, but how do you mechanize the unmechanizable? The solution: Azathoth has no statistics. Encountering it ends the game. Period. All characters die. Reality dissolves. The campaign concludes. This is the only mechanically honest approach. Some entities cannot be incorporated into gameplay structure without destroying that structure. Music captures Azathoth more effectively than visual media because music is abstract by nature. You're not looking at something, trying to process visual information. You're feeling something, responding to patterns that operate below conscious analysis. Avant-garde metal bands like Portal and Ulcerate create sonic textures that model chaos. Portal's music is deliberately disorienting. Atonal riffs, blast beats buried in distortion, vocals processed beyond intelligibility. Listening requires effort. It's not entertainment you passively consume. It's assault on comfortable listening habits. Their album Ion, 2018, explicitly references Lovecraftian themes while refusing to make them accessible or catchy. Dark ambient music maps even more directly onto Azathoth's nature. Projects like Cryosphere, Atrium Carceri, and others create soundscapes of infinite space, mechanical drones, barely perceptible melodies dissolving into noise. This is music that sounds like the void, like entropy, like meaning collapsing into chaos. You don't headbang to it. You're not supposed to. You listen in darkness and let the sound overwhelm normal perception. Classical composer Krzysztof Penderecki, particularly his Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, achieves similar effects through orchestral means. 52-string instruments playing clusters of microtones, creating sound that hurts to process. Penderecki's music sounds like reality tearing. It's not Lovecraftian by intent, but it captures what Lovecraft described: the sensation of encountering something that should not be encountered. The most successful adaptations understand absence. They don't show Azathoth. They don't explain it. They create conditions where audiences feel what it would be like to approach cosmic truth. Disorientation, dread, the sense that comfortable reality is thinner than assumed. Showing the entity fails, creating the emotional and cognitive experience of encountering it. That's where adaptation succeeds. The medium changes, but the principle remains. Suggestion over revelation, implication over explanation. The off-screen god more terrible than any god you could render on screen. And beyond entertainment, beyond adaptation, Azathoth has seeped into academic discourse, into subcultures, into the ways people think about existence itself. That intellectual and subcultural afterlife deserves examination. Gothic and industrial subcultures adopted Lovecraft's aesthetic decades ago. The imagery appears everywhere. Band names, album art, fashion choices, tattoos, tentacles, non-Euclidean angles, cosmic dread as personal style. But here's the uncomfortable question. Does the aesthetic carry the philosophy, or does it domesticate it? When you put Cthulhu on a t-shirt, you've made cosmic horror merchandise. You've made the unknowable knowable, the incomprehensible comprehensible, the terrifying comfortably spooky. This isn't critique of people who enjoy the aesthetic. There's genuine value in dark imagery, in embracing the macabre as counterpoint to forced positivity. But it's worth recognizing the distance between wearing a Necronomicon hoodie and actually confronting the philosophical implications of cosmic meaninglessness. Academia takes Lovecraft more seriously now than during his lifetime. S.T. Joshi's biographical and critical work, spanning decades, established Lovecraft as legitimate subject of literary study. Joshi's I Am Providence, 2013, remains the definitive biography, and his editorial work brought obscure Lovecraft texts to scholarly attention. China Mieville, both fantasist and Marxist theorist, analyzes Lovecraft through political lens. Mieville argues that cosmic horror expresses anxieties about capitalism, the sense of being controlled by vast, impersonal forces that operate according to incomprehensible logic. The market as Azathoth, blind, powerful, shaping reality through unconscious process rather than conscious design. This reading is controversial, but philosophically productive. It asks whether Lovecraft's horror accidentally describes economic alienation, where human agency disappears into systemic forces no individual controls. Graham Harmon's Weird Realism, 2012, brings continental philosophy to Lovecraft. Harmon reads Lovecraft through object-oriented ontology, the philosophical position that objects exist independently of human perception and resist complete understanding. Azathoth, in Harmon's reading, represents the ultimate withdrawn object, the thing in itself that exists beyond any possible relation, that cannot be reduced to its effects or appearances. Harmon treats Lovecraft as serious, philosopher, not just horror writer who happened to stumble onto philosophical themes. The new weird movement in contemporary speculative fiction, M. John Harrison, Jeff Vandermeer, Caitlin R. Kiernan, inherits Lovecraft's philosophical apparatus while often rejecting his racism and other problems. Vandermeer's Annihilation depicts Area X, a zone where reality operates by different rules, where human consciousness cannot maintain coherent identity. This is Lovecraftian horror updated, less about tentacled gods, more about the instability of reality itself. Psychology departments engage Lovecraft through terror management theory, the study of how humans respond to mortality awareness. Terror management theory proposes that much of human culture exists to buffer against existential dread, to create meaning that makes death bearable. Lovecraft's fiction systematically destroys those buffers. His stories don't just remind you that you'll die, they suggest that you never really lived, that consciousness itself is cosmic accident. Studies examining reader responses to cosmic horror provide data about how people process existential threats that cultural frameworks cannot neutralize. Comparative religion courses increasingly include Lovecraft when discussing modern mythology and invented religions. Scholars examine how Lovecraftian entities function religiously for some practitioners, how chaos magic incorporated mythos cosmology, how internet communities treat fictional entities as if they possess agency. This isn't arguing that Azathoth literally exists, but examining what it means that people relate to this entity as if it does. Philosophy departments wrestle with whether cosmic horror constitutes actual philosophy or just evocative metaphor. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, treats horror as serious philosophical investigation. Thacker distinguishes between the world for us, meaningful, the earth, world in itself, indifferent, and the planet, world without us, incomprehensible. Azathoth represents planetary reality, the cosmos that exists entirely independent of human existence, that would operate identically if consciousness had never emerged. Thomas Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, is horror writer doing continental philosophy. Ligotti argues that consciousness is evolutionary mistake, that self-awareness creates suffering, that the most honest philosophical position is antinatalism, the belief that it would have been better never to have been born. This is Lovecraftian philosophy stripped of fictional framework. No tentacles, no cultists, just the argument that existence itself is the horror, and consciousness is the capacity to recognize that horror. The tension throughout academic appropriation, studying forbidden knowledge academically, might sanitize what should remain dangerous. Analysis creates distance. Classification creates comfort. The professor, lecturing on cosmic horror, isn't experiencing cosmic horror. They're experiencing professional accomplishment, intellectual mastery, career advancement. But some ideas resist comfortable analysis. Some concepts continue disturbing even after extensive examination. And Azathoth, as philosophical proposition about existence itself, remains disturbing in ways that matter beyond academic discourse. That brings us to the final question. Why does this entity persist? What does its continued cultural relevance reveal? The only thing keeping you here is a terrible, endless flute song, played in the dark, by things that pray their God never, ever listens. That sentence should bother you more each time you consider it, because it reframes existence not as gift, not as trial, not as opportunity, but as fragile accident perpetually maintained against natural dissolution. Why does Azathoth persist nearly a century after Lovecraft created it? Why does this entity continue generating discussion, adaptation, philosophical analysis? Because it taps into something deeper than horror convention, deeper than cultural trend. It articulates an anxiety that has only intensified since Lovecraft's time. The fear that existence is contingent rather than necessary, that consciousness is aberration rather than achievement, that meaning is illusion rather than discovery. Post-religious anxiety explains part of the appeal. Western culture increasingly lacks shared religious frameworks. Surveys show declining religious affiliation, particularly among younger demographics. But losing religious belief doesn't eliminate the questions religion addressed. Why does anything exist? What is consciousness? Does suffering have purpose? For people who cannot accept traditional religious answers, but also cannot accept comfortable atheism, the belief that losing God means gaining freedom, Lovecraft offers third option. Not religious meaning, not secular optimism, but cosmic horror. The universe is neither divinely ordered nor neutrally indifferent. It's actively meaningless, and that meaninglessness has structure. The Anthropocene contributes to Azathoth's resonance. We live in an era of climate crisis, ecological collapse, systemic changes operating on scales that dwarf individual human action. You can recycle, reduce consumption, vote for environmental policies, and global temperatures continue rising. ice continues melting, species continue disappearing. The disconnect between individual agency and systemic outcome mirrors Lovecraft's cosmology. Vast forces operating according to logic that human will cannot alter. Climate change functions like blind, idiot God, not hostile, not trying to destroy humanity, just operating according to physical processes that happen to make human civilization unsustainable. Artificial intelligence and algorithmic systems create new flavors of Lovecraftian dread. Machine learning systems make decisions nobody fully understands, including the engineers who built them. Neural networks process data through billions of weighted connections, arriving at conclusions through processes that resist human comprehension. These systems aren't conscious, but they shape reality, determine what content you see, what prices you pay, whether you get hired, whether you get arrested. They're not blind, idiot gods, but they're mindless, powerful systems operating according to principles that transcend individual human understanding. The algorithm as Azathoth, unconscious, powerful, determining reality through process rather than purpose. Mental health discourse increasingly uses Lovecraftian metaphor. Depression gets described as the void, as sensation of meaninglessness that cannot be reasoned away. Dissociation gets compared to unreality, the sense that you're not quite present, that the world is dream state you're experiencing secondhand. Existential dread, the background radiation of anxiety about mortality and meaninglessness, maps onto cosmic horror perfectly. These aren't just literary devices. They're phenomenological descriptions of what consciousness feels like when it cannot maintain comfortable narratives about selfhood and significance. Philosophical horror as genre, distinct from horror that happens to contain philosophy, crystallizes these concerns. Thomas Ligotti, Eugene Thacker, and others write explicitly about consciousness as curse, existence as horror. They're not using philosophy to enhance scary stories. They're using scary stories to communicate philosophy that's too disturbing for academic prose. Sometimes the most honest way to discuss cosmic meaninglessness is through horror fiction, where dread can be acknowledged without defensive intellectualization. Cultural pessimism defines early 21st century in ways that parallel early 20th century when Lovecraft wrote. We face potential civilizational collapse through multiple vectors: climate, pandemic, political instability, economic inequality, nuclear risk. We possess unprecedented technological capability alongside unprecedented existential vulnerability. We can see the systems failing, can understand the mechanisms of collapse, but cannot seem to alter trajectory. That's cosmicism, clear-eyed recognition that knowledge doesn't equal power, that understanding doesn't enable control. The final implication is personal. You've spent this time learning about Azathoth, reading about the entity, the philosophy, the cultural impact, and now the concept exists in your mind. You cannot unknow it. The idea that reality might be accidental dream, that consciousness might be temporary glitch, that meaning might be illusion we construct to avoid confronting meaninglessness. These ideas persist after encountering them. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some thoughts, once thought, cannot be unthought. We open that door together. We looked at what exists at the center of cosmic horror. Not tentacles, not aliens, but the philosophical proposition that existence itself is accident maintained by nothing more substantial than blind process and cosmic indifference. So, you do not learn the origin of Azathoth. You learn that you and everything you know are the origin. You are a fleeting thought in a mind that cannot think. And the only thing keeping you here is a terrible, endless flute song played in the dark by things that pray their God never, ever listens.